Hello everyone. Welcome to a new chess video. You'll definitely want to make sure you save this video because it's going to become one of your absolute favorite videos on all of YouTube. I'm going to teach you exactly how to play the French defense in every single one of its many variations. In other words, once you've finished watching this video, you'll be more than ready to start playing the French defense, and no one will be able to surprise you with any variation. All right? What's the French defense, chess teacher? It's that simple. When they play the king's pawn e4, we play e6. For those who have no idea what the French defense is, it's really simple. We don't occupy the center directly because we're preparing with e6 first, so we can play d5 afterwards. Here, everyone plays d4. Why? Because they take advantage of the fact that we haven't occupied the center to take it themselves with their two pawns, right? And that's the correct way to continue. Whenever you haven't occupied the center, you place your two pawns right in the middle. Notice that both of their bishops can develop well, and both knights also have a great position. And here we're going to play d5. Up to this point, we have the French defense. It's just that simple. But here, there are four main variations, which we're going to narrow down to three. And I'm going to explain them to you in such a simple way that you'll be able to play them without any problem at all, without having to study entire books on the French defense just by watching this video. So if this video gets 300 likes, I'll make the same kind of video for the defense or opening of your choice. Just let me know in the comments. So let's get started. What options does white have here? Well, let me explain them to you first. I'll explain what options there are, and then we'll go through them one by one. The main one, and the one you'll face almost every time, is this one here, the advanced variation. They play e5, okay? Why? Because here, they get a lot of space, and we end up with much less. Now, I'm going to show you how to counterattack and how to play against that, because we have some spectacular plans. The other variation would simply be the exchange variation. What happens if they capture this pawn here, and how should we play? And finally, the Tarrasch variation, or the variation with knight to c3 and knight to d2, which honestly doesn't matter to us because we're going to play the same way. Man, it's very straightforward. All right then, let's get to it. Put your boots on because we're going to start right away with the advanced variation, which is probably the most played one. But make sure you don't overlook any of the variations, because if you study one more than the others, your opponent might play a different variation and you'll end up worse off, okay? All right, the most popular one, the advanced variation. What should we do when they play this advance here? Well, our plan, most of you probably know this, but if not, I'll explain it. It's very simple. It's to fight against this pawn right here, okay? This pawn on d4 is white's main favorite because it's the one holding the position together. Take a good look. If this pawn here disappears, look at how weak this area becomes. We'd probably end up winning it, right? So we'll simply start with c5 whenever they play the advanced variation against us. Right here, they really only have one good move. And that move is c3. Defending this square, if they defend it with another piece, like the knight, simply pawn takes pawn would give us a pretty significant advantage, since now this pawn will be very hard to defend, and we'll have a huge initiative to attack with our knights, even from here and here with the queen as well. They're practically never going to be able to defend it unless they seriously weaken themselves with this pawn, okay? So here, they only have one good move when we play c5, which is c3. Up to this point, everything is correct. How should we continue? Well, we simply continue with knight to c6, which is the main idea in the French defense advanced variation. Remember, the goal is to attack this square here. We are currently putting pressure on this specific point. Perfect. Our opponent is logically going to play the best move, which is knight to f3. They develop a knight and defend the d4 square. Like I said, don't worry if they don't play this move against you. I'm giving you the best line for white, because from here, if you use this plan against a weaker line from white, you'll end up even better, okay? So don't worry. All right, knight to f3, and here we're simply going to play knight to e7, and I'm going to explain why. If someone tries to get clever and defends this square with f4, then you'll play knight to h6. It's an ideal plan. Why? Because now this bishop can't trade with this knight, and so we won't have to double our pawns. And also, this knight is going to have a fantastic square on f5, and will attack this d4 point, which is exactly what we want, remember? However, we're only going to do this if they play f4. Notice that if they play the normal knight to f3, we'll bring out this knight from g to e7. Why? Because if we bring it out over here, they'd trade and we'd end up with doubled pawns. On the other hand, from here, it's already aiming at the f5 square again to come and attack this point. Pay close attention, because you need to understand something very important whenever they play the advanced variation against you. We have a good bishop and a bad bishop, okay? This bishop is the bad one. Why? Simply because it's blocked by our own pawn structure. This bishop is good, even though it seems like it doesn't have many possible moves. However, you'll see, coming up, that this bishop is going to be very useful in the opening. That said, it's important to develop this knight first, because if we develop the bishop first, notice that this knight can't come out here, here, or here because the bishop is in the way. So it's extremely important to bring out this knight to e7 first, okay? Alright, our opponent can continue with a lot of different ideas. They can develop this bishop, which is the most common move to be able to castle quickly, right? If, for example, they play bishop to d3, which isn't the move I'm going to recommend to you, what should you do? Well, simply pawn takes pawn, and start putting pressure on this d4 square. I'm telling you, it's going to be a real headache for your opponents to defend this point. All right? So let's suppose that here, instead of placing the bishop blocking the queen's defense, they put it on e2, which might be a slightly more precise move. In that case, we're simply going to do the same thing. We're going to capture. You can see that it's very easy to play if you really understand the concepts. I want to put all my effort into explaining it in a way that all of you will be able to understand it right away. And even if you don't get it the first time, just by watching this video as many times as you need, you'll be able to play it perfectly. Perfect. We exchange these pawns when they develop the bishop. Make sure to remember that, okay? First we develop the knights, and then we exchange here. With what idea? Well, simply knight to f5. Notice that we're doing the same thing over and over. For now, notice one thing. We're attacking this pawn with 2 pieces, and they're defending it with 2. So, for now, there's nothing to worry about. If here they just play a move like castling, what we're going to do is keep putting pressure on this point with queen to b6. And as you can see, all the moves here are already starting to get dangerous for white. Notice that unless they play perfectly, this is what's great about this defense, unless they play perfectly, our pressure is going to be overwhelming. Here we already have a pretty significant advantage. Now we're attacking this point with 3 pieces, and there's no satisfactory way to defend it, because I'm sure you all see that the only way to defend the d4 square is bishop to e3. And bishop to e3 has a serious problem. It's given up a pawn. Which pawn is being given up? This b2 pawn. As you can see, it's giving up this pawn. They should develop this knight. We keep attacking this point. That is, here, after the move queen to b6, we're putting a lot of pressure on this d4 square, and things are getting really complicated for the white pieces. So let's take a move back. When we play knight to f5, they really have to be extremely precise, okay? They can't just play castling or make a move that doesn't make any sense at all, because then we'll simply play queen to b6, and we're going to gobble up that pawn right away. And let me tell you something, once you take that pawn, which you'll manage to do in many of your games, what's going to happen? Not only will you have an extra pawn, but you're going to blow your opponent's whole position wide open. Because now this pawn, which was very well defended, will no longer be so well protected, and the position will be so easy for you to play that you'll achieve great success. Now then, what move should they play instead of castling? Well, here they have several possible moves. The main and best one is knight to c3, and I'm going to explain why. The good thing about this defense is that you have to find the precise moves, just like I'm telling you. Now, when we play queen to b6 to keep attacking, you might say, come on, ChessTeacher, we're in the same situation as before. This pawn's being attacked by 3 pieces, and it's not easy to defend either. In fact, the only move they have is bishop to e3, and the exact same thing would happen again. I could even trade knight for bishop, pawn takes bishop, and queen takes on b2, winning a pawn again. However, here they shouldn't play bishop to e3. Instead, knight to c3 was to set up the move knight to a4, the only move that saves white. Notice how it's already getting complicated, right? King to f1 would also save the position, to avoid possible checks later on. However, I doubt you'll see king to f1 played in your games, okay? because that would lose castling rights, and unless your opponent is really, really good, they probably won't play it. In fact, if your opponent is really, really good, well, you can rest assured because whether they play this move or another, they're definitely going to put pressure on you, okay? Here, the correct and most commonly played move is knight to a4. Why? Because we're still attacking the square with 3 pieces, but at the same time, our queen is under attack. So we have to prioritize defending the queen. What are we going to do? We're simply going to give a check. How? Queen to a5, check. Careful, because we're attacking with this check. The queen is already moved away from the pen. Well, not the pen, sorry, from the thread. And now they have to block the check, right? If, for example, they play bishop to d2, we would simply bring our bishop in. And notice that after the exchanges, because if not, we would be the ones to exchange and end up capturing this pawn here, pay close attention. Bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop, queen takes queen. And it doesn't matter if it's knight takes queen or king takes queen, this pawn would be completely defenseless. So normally they would be the ones to exchange. Once they exchange, we simply capture with the queen, check, and then we're going to capture either this pawn here or this pawn over here. So notice that bishop to d2 doesn't work to block the check, even though it seems like a really interesting move. Also, notice here that if we play bishop takes and queen takes, they're also leaving this knight here undefended. So, final summary. If we play queen to a5, the only move they have is knight to c3, bringing the knight back. Alright, so what should we do if they make the right move and bring the knight back? Well, it's very simple. We'll go back to queen b6 and we'll have this attack here. If you see that they're being stubborn and trying to do the same thing again, you have two options. Either go for a draw if your opponent is stronger, so you repeat moves here and get a draw, or try to be a bit more aggressive. And what's the more aggressive option? Well, instead of moving the queen to give check, you come in and give check directly with a bishop. With what result? Now, simply when they block, which they can do now, we're going to play queen to a5 because we have to move the queen away. Make sure you remember this, okay? They're attacking our queen. Giving checks is one thing, but giving away the queen is another, right? Very good. We move her away and put pressure here. When they castle, no matter what they do, simply take with the bishop, and after knight takes, queen takes. If they take with the queen, we exchange queens, and if they take with the knight, we capture here. In both variations, we end up with an extra pawn. Conclusion of this advanced variation, it's very, very simple, as you've seen. Our idea is to bring our pieces in to put pressure on the d4 square. Also, I've shown you how to play if your opponent makes the best moves. Now you're going to be really happy because the first variation I showed you, which is the advanced variation, is probably the one with the most theory and maybe the hardest to understand. Although I think I explained it in a simple way so that everyone can understand and use it in your games. We have two variations left, the exchange variation and the knight variation. If your opponent plays either of these two variations, you can be pretty relaxed. Just like with the advanced variation, you can also feel confident if you know these, even more so, because we're simply going to recapture with the pawn, and attacking ideas are very hard for white to pull off. Normally, those who play the exchange variation play correctly. Knight to f3, to which we respond symmetrically with knight to f6, bishop to d3, and we also respond symmetrically with bishop to d6. Why do they play bishop to d3? It's very simple, right? Bishop to e2 would also be possible. However, this bishop doesn't really thrive over here. On the other hand, over here it points toward a possible kingside castle. In fact, it can't go here or here because we would simply play c6 and this bishop would have to retreat and they would have just given us a tempo. That's why I don't dwell too much on this bishop to d3 move. Simply bishop to d6 for the same reason, right? It's the best position for this light squared bishop for white and for the dark squared bishop for us. Alright, so here, how can the game continue? Well, with castling right, if your opponent tries to play c4 first, I recommend that you capture this pawn and play against this isolated pawn. You should know that whenever there is a double queen's pawn, even though the French defense is an open king's pawn opening, in the exchange variation, it turns into a queen's pawn variation. Now you can see what a double queen's pawn is. So whenever you have a double queen's pawn variation, the c-file pawn is the one responsible for unbalancing this double central pawn structure, right? So when they play c4, now I'm going to explain how you should play with bishop with pawn takes pawn, okay? It's very simple. If they don't play c4, then they can't really cause you any problems, because notice that's the only issue they can present in this situation. All right, if they castle first, you castle too, You just keep making moves, right? And when they play c4, pawn takes pawn. All right, why pawn takes pawn if it seems like we're improving their bishop, leaving them with a central pawn and we don't have one? Excuse me? Well, it's because now we're going to give our opponent some serious problems. First of all, this isn't a very well-known variation, and we're throwing our opponent off their game, because they're not expecting us to give up our central pawn for a side pawn. However, playing against an isolated pawn is very comfortable. For example, knight to c6 attacking this pawn. And a lot of you might say, come on, Chester, this move seems weak. We're letting this pawn advance under really good conditions. However, this doesn't bother us because we have good retreats for the knight. Knight to a5 in this case, hitting this bishop, and if it comes over here, we would simply trade it. And on top of that, we'd end up with a much better position thanks to having a strong pair of bishops. All right, so this bishop has to retreat. Not here because it would lose the pawn, so it has to go to e2. And so here we have a pretty surprising move, which is knight takes pawn. Notice how simple this has been, right? If you didn't understand it, rewind the video. I don't want this to get too long. Why can we give up this knight? It's very simple. Now, it's because this knight can't be taken, since then bishop takes would come with a discovered attack, check, and we'd snatch the queen. That's why we can capture this pawn here without any problems. And here we'd end up with an extra pawn. Notice that they couldn't advance this pawn here. Why am I telling you this? Because notice that here, almost no one expects us to capture this pawn, bishop takes, and play against this isolated pawn. And when we attack here, honestly, a lot of people will play this pawn advance, which is a small mistake thanks to knight to a5 attacking the bishop and then being able to sacrifice this knight for a pawn, which really is not a sacrifice at all because this knight cannot be taken. But what happens if they don't push this pawn and just keep playing in a totally normal and calm way, like with knight to c3? Well, you don't need to worry at all, because here we have a really good position to play. Notice that we have material equality, but our opponent has an isolated pawn, which is always a target for attack. So, you'll have a super comfortable game. For example, if you don't want any kind of problems, you play h6, and this bishop can't go anywhere important anymore. For instance, it can only come here. Then you develop your bishop, and you'll play an extremely comfortable game, where you can fight against this pawn here thanks to the pressure from your pieces. So you're also going to want them to play this variation against you. Honestly, when you finish this video and have studied it thoroughly, you'll really want to play the French defense, because you'll be able to handle all of your opponent's responses, and you'll like all of them. And now we just have the last variation left, which is the knight variation, both knight to c3 and knight to d2. I told you it was exactly the same because we're going to play pawn takes pawn, okay? And now, what difference does it make if the knight's here or here? They have to recapture this pawn and we end up in the same position. Take a good look. The great thing about this video is that by just mastering these 3 variations, you'll be able to play the French defense forever. From here, if you want, you can even go deeper and study even more, right? But if you just study these 3 variations well with this video, believe me, you're going to play the French defense at a really high level, which is a defense that gives some truly spectacular results, even in slow tournament games. All right, very good. So what are we going to play here? Well, we simply develop with bishop to e7. Don't worry, this variation is very easy to play, and you're going to love it. We develop this bishop to e7, they keep developing their pieces, knight to f3, and we play knight to f6. Here they have 2 options, all right? They can either exchange or let us exchange. If they exchange, great. Why not? Because this bishop on f6 is going to become a real attacking machine, right? This bishop here defends the castling and points toward the queen side. In the future, if we ever get really worried, we can always pull the bishop back here and we'll have a super solid castling. And the other option is that, for example, they just keep developing with bishop to d3, defend this knight, and then we're the ones who will capture, okay? In both cases, don't worry. Just like in the first variation, which is more theoretical and where you need to understand the theoretical moves better, in these 2 variations, like the exchange and the 2 knights, it really doesn't matter where they go. It's more about understanding the concepts, which are actually very simple if you manage to grasp them. In this case, if you understand the opening better than your opponent, you'll most likely end up winning the game. We castle calmly, it really doesn't matter because what's our plan? Well, look, knight to d7 is much better than knight to c6. Let me explain why. If you don't understand this plan, you might be asking, why knight to d7? We'll reposition it here, placing the knight better to aim at the center. You know this knight is the best castle defender, and plus, we gain the initiative. Knight to d7, let's say, for example, rook to e1, just to mention something, and then knight to f6. Very important. We attack this bishop, which has to retreat. Now, all we have left is to develop this bishop. You might suggest bishop d7, but b6 is better to develop the bishop here. And look at what a wonderful position this is. This bishop in fianchetto is spectacular. This bishop is super solid. We have our pieces really solid. We're not going to leave anything hanging, and they're very well placed. b6. Our opponent might play c3, supporting this d4 square, which can become very weak, as we've seen before, bishop b6. And here, queen to c2 attacking would be a mistake, because with the bishop on b6, we could always open up the king. Be a bit more careful, and instead of queen c2, play bishop to f4. How do we continue? Well, the plan from now on is very simple. The bishop, even though it's blocking here, we could even come in through here, attacking very strongly. The bishop here becomes even more passive. Here it doesn't attack anything at all, because this pin is defended by the bishop on d7. We can even attack this bishop and it doesn't matter to us. So the strongest move is bishop to f4. And here we're simply going to exchange these bishops. If it retreats, it loses a tempo, because we're attacking here. c5, queen c7, applying pressure, we attack here and here. So they usually capture the bishop, logically, and here you can capture with the queen or the pawn. I recommend capturing with the queen because this pawn can always come to c5 and attack a lot. And notice that this is quite a solid position. So you understand, as I mentioned, here you shouldn't memorize moves, just the first ones, but above all, the ideas. Let's continue with a real game so you can see how this type of opening can develop. This is extremely important because this way you'll have a real-life example of how to play in your own games, right? For example, here, white played knight to e5, greatly improving this knight, and as I just mentioned, c5 is a fundamental move. Why? Because it develops, well, not develops, but puts pressure on the center, with this very important c-pawn, as I always say, to act against this pawn here. Right now, pawn takes pawn is being threatened, and even though it wouldn't work at this moment, pay close attention, okay? Pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn would be a mistake, because simply bishop takes h7 check would come, attacking with a discovered check, and we would lose the queen. So simply, after pawn takes pawn and pawn takes pawn, we wouldn't capture here, okay? We would play a different kind of move, like moving the king or something like that, and this pawn would be isolated. That's why they capture here. Once they capture, here the player with the black pieces, instead of recapturing, played queen to e5. Queen to e5 is a really good move, because it gets ready to recapture whenever they want, but it also threatens checkmate. That's why you have to be super attentive. White played queen to f3, and black simply ruined their opponent's pawn structure. How? Queen takes queen, knight takes bishop, knight, pawn takes bishop. And now, after these exchanges, what they've done is ruin and play against the solidity of our pawn structure. You already know that recently, I think it was 2 days ago, I posted a video, which I recommend 100% if you want to improve your chess level, about how to play your pawn structure well, and how this will give you many victories. And the game ended quickly, pawn takes pawn. If you want, finish watching this game and then go check out the other video, which I'll leave for you in the description. Now, white attacked the rook. Take a good look at this way in Minning. He puts pressure on the b file, he just needs to play b3. Instead of capturing this bishop, which would fix the opponent's pawn structure, he plays knight to h4. Why? Because he wants to go for knight to h5, because he wants to go for knight to f4 and improve the position of this knight, which can still become stronger and stronger. Rook to d1, rook to d8, facing off rooks on open files, c4. I'll go through this part faster because it's not important. f5, putting pressure on this bishop, which has to move, and now, yes, knight to f4, and black has a pretty comfortable game. They're going to improve their kings, right? Notice how both of them maneuver. He has to try to do something, right? For example, here I play this move first, although it doesn't really matter because after the exchanges, this check came and the white king has to move. And now watch closely how black starts to put on the pressure. This position's completely won. And whatever white does, look, here he stops any possible counterplay, comes over to exchange here, and it's clear that this position is way too easy for the black pieces to squeeze. Look, check on g2. The king has to move to dark square so it doesn't get in the bishop's way. And the black king, well, the black king breaks in like nothing. And this position is completely won. With your opponent's pieces tied down, attack and win the pawns. This pawn will be lost regardless of how he defends it. Why? Because the king was also responsible for defending this bishop. And this is a completely one-pawn endgame for black. Why? because the king is much more active. I'm not going to focus on this any further. Pay close attention, okay? I'm going to go through this quickly because here black simply wins with great ease. White is never going to be able to promote a pawn, not even close, okay? Look at everything they still have to do, and black would have way too much time to promote first. So I hope you really enjoyed this video on the French defense. If you've made it to the end, please, I'm asking you, leave a like. It doesn't cost you anything, and share it with your friends so you can all become better players and help each other out. This defense is one of my favorites. I hope I explained it wonderfully so that everyone understood me, and I hope you put it into practice. See you tomorrow, friends, in another new video. Goodbye.